Way.
Okay, so again, we're continuing our discussions from the Mishnah that brought the machlokes between Rav Meir and the Rabbanon with regard to the question of one who finds a loan document, whether he can return it to the creditor or not. So this is an ongoing discussion that we've had for several weeks. We continue that discussion. Last week, we wanted to understand the machlokes in Rav Meir Rabbanon, and there was a machlokes between Rav Eliezer and Rabbi Yochanan on how to interpret that machlokes. So just quickly, Rav Eliezer, it was the one who said that the machlokes is the she'ein chayav modeh, meaning when the debtor does not admit that he owes a loan. And that was one of the salient points. Rabbi Yochanan argues on that and says that it was that the debtor, the instance of the Mishnah is when the debtor did admit. That's what the Gemara really wants to tell us. And that the other major dispute is whether we're concerned for paro and the kanunya, meaning for trickery between the debtor and the creditor, that even if the debtor was already paid, if the note is found, he will admit that it wasn't paid because he will collude with the creditor that will collect a second time from the chasam mishabadim, from the indebted properties. So the person whose property, person who bought the property from the debtor will then have to give it back because the loan document included a pledge of encumbered properties. And therefore, we're concerned for that. According to Rabbi Eliezer, we're not concerned for Paro and Kanunya, and according to Rabbi Yochanan, we are. Okay, so that was the machlokes. So we said it, and it brought a proof from a brisa. At the end of that proof, the Gemara says that this brisa disputes with Rabbi Eliezer on one point and with Shmuel on 2 points. And we ended on the top of Yudal and Amid Aleph that the machlokes, that the dispute with Rabbi Eliezer on one point had to do with the point that Rabbi Eliezer says in the top second line, machlokes she'ein chayav modeh, because Rabbi Eliezer says that we're dealing with a situation of ein chayav modeh, and the brisa speaks about a situation of chayav modeh. So that's the refutation on Rabbi Eliezer. But the Gemara then went on to say that Shmuel, the refutation on Shmuel was on 2 points. And this is what we'll pick up today, third line from the top. The Gemara says, Tiyufta de Shmuel betarta. As a result of this brisa, there are 2 disputes on Shmuel, meaning Shmuel's position is going to be knocked out or disputed on 2 points. One, Chada Kirabi Elazar. One of the disputes on Shmuel will be the same one we had on Rabbi Eliezer. Why? Because Shmuel was the first one who came along and said, you know what? Our Mishnah is speaking by Ein Chayiv Modeh, and he goes on to explain the Mishnah. And that brisa specifically proves that it speaks by Chayiv Modeh, that the whole discussion that we've been having is when the lovet does admit that he owes the money. Otherwise, they say, of course you can't collect. So that's one sort of argument or blemish on Shmuel. The Choda, and the second one, the Omer Shmuel. Now here's where we're going to get into a whole new discussion. Because Shmuel says, remember, because Shmuel says that if you find a shtar haknor was a specific type of loan document where the debtor pledged to the creditor automatically, whether or not there was a loan, whether there was not a loan, called a shtar haknor. It's different than a regular loan where there has to actually be a loan in order for there to be a pledge of repayment. In a shtar haknor, the debtor is confident that he will get the loan at some point, even if it's later on. Therefore, he says, I'm pledging to the creditor, I will pay him no matter what. So Shmuel says, if you find a shtar haknor b'shut, yachzel abalim, you return it to the Balin, v'lo chashinan lipiroin. And we're not afraid of piron. Why? Because a shtar hakna, what difference is it whether he paid or not? It's an automatic, he has to pay him. So he says, v'lo chashinan lipiron. Now,
Rabbi,
yeah,
it's Yale. Just a
yeah.
quick question. I was reading ahead a little bit. I tried to, and I didn't understand what's the benefit of this shtar hakna. Why would a person enter into it? What does he get out of it as opposed to simply waiting until the transaction takes place and then he puts up his property? What's the benefit of doing it no matter what?
Well,
Or is it just he's so confident he doesn't really care?
yeah, I'm not sure that's a real benefit because what he's saying is, this shtar, I want this to be an ironclad shtar because I'm going to pay this fellow. There's no question that I'm going to pay this fellow, and he may have other motives. He may have other motives why he's willing to say, you know what, this may take some time. I don't want to get into machlokes. It's going to happen. Therefore, let's not get into sort of side discussions. I'm going to pledge that I'm going to pay him. Maybe he feels that he needs to pay him for other reasons. And if this halva doesn't go through, there'll be other reasons why he has to pay him. So he's not mindful of the fact that, this has to happen. So Hashtar Hakna, and let's take, I don't know if Rashi says even more, but Bishtar Hakna, Shemakdal Lechosov Mahayom Ben Yilva Ben Lo Yilva, Igman Laosas Man Mahayom. Yeah, Rashi just says that regardless of the actual loan, he wants to make this payment. So I mean, he doesn't go any further than that. But so I'm not sure there has to be an ulterior motive other than he's going to make it. He wants to commit to it, and therefore there should be no sort of issues going on here. Okay. So according to now, Shmuel is the one who introduced to us the concept that when a loan document is paid, it is ripped up, meaning the idea of a cancellation. Till then, we never had that. It never came up at all. Shmuel says we're not worried about a double dip where there's going to be collusion, because if it was already paid, it would have been ripped up. The fact that it's not ripped up means it was never paid by definition. So according to Shmuel, lo chashinu lipiron. We're not afraid of piron because otherwise there would be no shtar here. That shtar would have been ripped up, right? So let's take a look at Rashi. He commits himself even without a loan. Says Rashi, even if the chayiv is not moda, which is what Shmuel says. In other words, he says, no, I never made the loan. The parah mikruhu korale. If there was such a payment made, it would have been ripped up. In the Brisa, even though both agree that it was not paid up, and you're afraid of what? Of kanunya, of some kind of collusion. I'm not afraid, says Shmuel, because that shtar would have been ripped up, so there could never be collusion. Can never be collusion. So says the Gemara, Tiyufta. That's a kasha, the Ketani Hacha, because in the Brisa we say Afal Pishishnei Modim. He's now quoting the Brisa, even though both the Lova and the Malva admit that there was no repayment. Lo Yachse Lo Lozeh Lo Lozeh Al Machashin Lipiron. So we see from the Brisa that we are afraid of Piron. That's the Tiyufta about it. That's the kasha and Shmuel, because the Brisa says beferish that we're afraid of Piron. The Kolshkein Hacha de Lo Moda. Lova the chashinan lipiron. Certainly, in our case, where the lova is not moda, even if he is moda, but if he's not moda, then the Brisa says you're suspect duplicity and collusion. And here comes Shmuel and says, I'm not worried. So that's the tiyufta on Shmuel. Now, the Shmuel is true to his own position, where he says you can't have collusion because there would never be a shtar available to collude. If it's paid, it's ripped up. If it's not paid, it's a real shtar. Yet the Brisa tells us we are afraid of collusion. That's the tiyufta. That's the kasha on Shmuel's position. It says Rashi, v'kolshkein v'she'ena moda, v'holo kasha l'Rabbi Eliezer. And this is not a kasha. In other words, we say it's tiyufta the Shmuel, but not tiyufta the Rabbi Lezer on this. Why? V'halo kasha Rabbi Lezer the who omer b'she'ein chayiv moda lo yachze shum shtar h'roi ligvos. You never return the shtar. The Hakamer of Meir yachzeh mishum delav bar gaviyahu. So according to Rabbi Lezer, you never return it. So therefore, there's no kasha. There's no kasha here. According to Shmuel, you return it. That's why it's a tiyufta, because here he says we're afraid of collusion. So that's the kasha.
Rabbi, does it sound like the possibility that in different communities they had different practices? That Surah and Hardah, maybe they ripped it up in some places and they didn't rip them up in other places?
Well, again, no. According to Shmuel, he says that was the common practice, that there would never be a shtar left over in a paid situation. That shtar would be ripped up. So he doesn't say it's a regional thing. According to him, that's the again, he was they were in Bavel, so in Bavel probably what they did in Eretz Yisrael, I'm not sure, I don't know, but certainly he's saying that where we are, that's not an issue. Otherwise, David, I mean, you could, if everything is local and not more universal, then you always have machlekes. We're going to see this, by the way, in a different way, euphemistically, in a couple of lines, where you can always make the argument, oh yeah, he comes from Chelem, and the Chelem they had a different nusach, or he comes from from Pumbedisa, and Pumbedisa was different. So according to Shmuel, it was universal. So how do you understand this? Okay, so that's the kasha on Shmuel. So now Shmuel is going to tell us something very novel. Omar Shmuel, so to for Shmuel, because it's Tirta on Shmuel, Omar Shmuel, my Tamad Rabbanon, why is this okay? Why is it not a kasha? Sover Achrayis Toas Soifahu. He said Achrayis Toas Soifer. So let's look at Rashi. You have to understand this. My Tamad Rabbanon the Amri ki Aimbo Achrayis Mechosim Gover Afmin Shubadim. Why did the rabbi say that even when there is no achrayis, because the Rabbanan say when there's no shtar achrayis, you can collect from the chosim mishubadim? How can that be? So he says achrayis tofa sofa Rashi kishe'ena kosav b'shtar, when an achrayis is not written in the shtar, sofa hu shetah, the sofa forgot to write it. A person would never lend his money without a pledge. Why? Because no one throws out money for nothing. What does he mean to say? If I borrow money from you and you do not have an achrayis, then basically you're throwing away money, because let's say more likely than not, but certainly there's a circumstance where you the creditor, are going to come back to me, and I'm going to say, sorry, Reuben, I don't have the money. And then what are you going to do? You're going to look at me like a fool. Okay, so what's the next step? There's no pledge. Where are you going to collect the money from? I don't have the money. So Shmuel is saying no one would be foolish enough to lend money to someone else without some kind of a fallback. Right, and that's pretty much the way we conduct business today. I mean, even for a very long time, there always had to be, unless someone was charitable and says, "Okay, if you don't pay me, it's tzedakah. It's tzedakah." Okay, treat it as if you gave charity. But I'm not a fool. If I'm lending money, I want to know that my money is collectible. So you got to give me some collateral. You see that? I mean, the Torah talks about collateral, talks about getting collateral, clothing or other things, and there's a whole halacha what you have to do with that. You have to give it back at night, take it for the day. But so he's saying that achrayis tois soifahu, that if there is no pledge in a document, it means that the sofer made a mistake. The sofer accidentally omitted it, but we have to impute that there is achrayis. So therefore, Shmuel says, you know what? I'm not afraid of Pharaoh. I'm not afraid of trickery, because first of all, the shtar would be ripped up. But according to the Rabbanan, who say that he learned shot in the Rabbanan that even without achrayus nechasim, you collect from shabadim. That's because there was achrayus, there was a pledge, because a shtar can't exist without a pledge. So that's a big chiddush that the Gemara is not going to take off on, where Shmuel tells us that achrayus tor seifahu, that it has to be a mistake because no one would lend without a pledge. All right. So he's laying down a marker, just like Shmuel laid down a principle that we're not afraid of Piron because of the concept of Korah, that you always tear the shtar. Shmuel's laying down a principle that achrayus to'es sofer, that there always is a pledge in a document. No such thing as a document without a pledge. And therefore, if the sofer didn't include it, the parties certainly concluded that there was a pledge. That's the key. The key is the parties never had a havamina that there wasn't a pledge. It doesn't say it in the shtar. That was a mistake of the scribe. It was an oversight. But the parties never understood that the loan did not have a pledge. That's Shmuel's chiddush here. It's like the Gemara. Amalei Rava Ba'isi Rav Adi Ba'avin. Rava Ba'isi says in the name of Adi Ba'avin, Mio Mishmol Hachi. Did Shmuel really lay down this principle? For Omer Shmuel says, Sheva, Shafir, V'shibud, Sorech Limlok. Okay, so we'll see what this is in a minute. But these three things that apply to a field, you have to consult with the seller every time you want to put him in a shtar. In other words, he wants to basically say, Shmuel, you're saying that things are imputed. I'm going to show you that there are things that are not imputed in a shtar, that you have to specifically go to the party to request. Do you want this in the shtar? Do you want this in the shtar? So in other words, he's saying, so you see that between the scribe and the party involved, there always has to be a discussion before you put something in a shtar. How can you say it's automatically imputed? Okay, so let's understand what these three Shevach, Shafir, V'shibud are. Let's understand what he's talking about. So look at Rashi. Shevach, Shafir, V'shibud, Tzorech Limloch. Tzorech Limloch means you have to consult. Hasofer Tzorech Limloch B'mocher. When someone is selling a field, then the sofer has to consult with the seller, lishel haimenu, to ask him, im yekabel alav lichtov v'shtar ha'mechira, whether he, the sofer who's writing the shtar, it's the sofer who hires the scribe, the seller who hires the scribe. So the scribe has to ask the seller, im yekabel alav lichtov v'shtar ha'mechira, do you agree that in this sales contract that you pledge to Shabbat lo nechosov l'mechira zu, she'im yavo bal chovo v'yitrofeno min alakeach she'yigo lakeach zeh hakeren v'hashema. In other words, do you pledge that when you're selling this to somebody else, and then let's say someone will come and say, oh, no, I have rights to this field, and it's going to go to the buyer, and it's going to say to the buyer, this is my field. I have a prior pledge with the seller, so you can't keep this field. So what happens? He can take the field. So the sofer asks the mocher, do you want me to put in a pledge? And in this pledge, do you want to have that if the buyer who loses the field, right, to the third party comes back to the seller, he not only gets the field, but what happens if he started planting in the field? And he made this field maybe worth 50% more because of this planting. He's now going to come back to the seller and says, seller, they took this field away from me because you had pledged this field before you sold it to me. I want a comparable field, but I want to be paid for my work. I want to be paid for the shvach, for the improvement of the land, right? Or shafir. What happens? In other words, in the course of the transaction, the buyer says to the seller, if someone comes and takes this field away from me because you pledged it, I want to go back to you and I want a pledge of other fields that you have that you may have sold to a third person. Not only did the did the seller sell the field to the buyer and pledge it, he also sold his other fields. So he now has no fields at all. And so the buyer is going to come back to the seller and say, wait a minute, you pledged in this document that you're going to repay me for the increased value. You also pledged that you're going to pay me from other fields that you have, and now you sold them. I want to go to those other fields and reclaim them. So now it becomes even more complicated because you're going to have a mocher who's going to go to the seller and say, seller, who did you sell this field to? Oh, Yehuda? I'm going to Yehuda. And you pledged to me that that field can be mine. So in other words, you see how far afield this can go now. So Rashi says, and he wants it mishape idishim and chasim. Not only, sorry, not only does he want to get his field back, but if the seller has better fields and medium fields and sort of weak, lesser fields, I want to collect from the best fields you have. I don't want a middle field. I want the best fields. So all these things, the sofer consults with the seller and says to the seller, seller, tell me what you want me to write. Do you want me to write that you're pledging other fields? Do you want me to write that you'll repay him for the produce that he planted? Do you want me to write that when if you have to repay, you'll repay from the best field? All these things have to be individually discussed with the seller. And the im lo nimlach bo, and if he doesn't agree, lo yichtav. Sheyesh mocher, there are sellers, she'ein mekabel of achrayus. There's a mocher who says, no, I'm selling it as is. There's no strings attached. I have no responsibilities. But even if he agrees to pay the keren, lo kibel ala shvach. He doesn't agree to pay for shvach, for the increased value because he planted. And even if he does both, lo kibel hakbiyah min idis. I'm not repaying for the idis, element abeidin. What's the point? The point here, you want to give a teretz and be mechadish to us that achrayus told sofer that when there is no achrayus, it's a mistake of the sofer. We see here Rav Adam says in the name of Shmuel that Shmuel says shevach shefer v'shevet tzorach limloch. That in the case of discussions between a sofer and a seller on the particulars of a sale, there has to be discussed and negotiated. Isn't tall sofer? So that's the kasha. The kasha on Shmuel is, you see from another place where Shmuel basically is saying there's no tall sofer. Everything has to be discussed, particularly how do you, Shmuel, come to impute this? So the answer here, David, is what you were alluding to before. So basically he's saying that the one who learned that Shmuel says Achrayus to a sofer is a different man da Omar who comes and says no, that Shmuel has to announce everything, it has to discuss everything with the sofer with great particularity, that there's no such thing as tol sofer. So he wants to sort of slough it off and say manda maha lo amaha, which is again that's Rashi le manda maha mishmei de Shmuel lo maha v'amuroim ninu aliba de Shmuel. It's different amuroim, different. Remember, Shmuel was at the end of the Tanaic period, so you had a lot of people who came after Shmuel who were interpreting Shmuel's Torah. So the one who interpreted Shmuel's Torah to say that tall sofer is one Amayra. The one who came, Rabbi Ba'isi, Rav Idi Bar Avin, who wants to interpret the Shmuel, says, no, Shmuel says that you have to do it with particularity. It's not a particularly strong teretz, but the Gemara from time to time, when it has no other teretz, says it's different interpretations of Shmuel, but what does Shmuel say? Okay, but so that's really sort of the teretz.
Same thing happens to Rabbi Yochanan in many places.
Say again?
The same thing happens to Rabbi Yochanan in many places. There were many interpreters of what he said.
Exactly right. So, in other words, where you're at a loss, where you have beferish, a contradiction, then we say it can't be contradiction. Shmuel doesn't. It's not a contradiction in Shmuel. It's a contradiction in those who learn pshat in Shmuel, just like you say, Rabbi Yochanan and others. So that's one teretz. That's one term. Says the Gemara, no. Lo kasha. Okay, we'll put that aside. That's not a kasha. Why? Because we're talking about two different circumstances. Kan b'shtar halva, by a loan document, the lawyer yoiv inish zuze b'chdi. The principle of a person who wouldn't lend money foolishly applies by a halva. So by halva, we can say achrai is Torah sofer because he would never lend money without a pledge because he's not a fool. He doesn't want to lose his money. He knows that if he doesn't have a pledge, it's as good as given away because you'll assume the lover says, I don't have the money. It would be great if he did, but assuming he doesn't have the money and you know that going in, then no one would do that. So therefore, we're saying it has to be imputed that it meant that there was a pledge because he would never have loaned him without a pledge. That's one way. But the Gemara that brings down where he says that you consult, kan b'mekach umemkar, that's not speaking about a loan. That's speaking about a sale. Why? The ovid inish dezovan aral yuma. A person would sell a piece of property if only for one day. If he only gets one day out of it, okay, what does that mean? I mean, we have to understand. But he's making a chilik between a loan document and a sale document. With a loan document, you would never have a document without a pledge. Forget about it. You have to have a pledge. In a sale document, then you have the sofer and the seller going over the particulars. Now, why? So look at Rashi. Bishtar halva tol soferhu. You have to say that there was a mistake in the sofer. Why? Given the lo ochel peres, lo mishani midi. What does the lender get out of this? Ribis, he doesn't collect, no interest. Okay, so out of the goodness of his heart, he's going to lend him the money. Let him give him the money for charity. Let him take it out of his pocket, give him tzedakah, and at least he'll get a mitzvah out of it. But if he's lending money, he gets no mitzvah out of it, and the lover doesn't have the money, then he's really a fool. What is he doing? Why is he lending him money for nothing? What does he get out of it? Says Rashi, Tall sofa who given the low ochel Paris, he doesn't get food. The low mishani midi, and he doesn't benefit. Low shutters was mechdi. Those fail below achrayas. He would never lend it without a pledge. And the debtor, he may have been an innocent guy or he may have been a cunning guy. He went ahead and he sold all of his other property. He has nothing left and there's no pledge. When the creditor, the malva comes, he finds nothing. There we say achray is told sofer. That's when we say it. But of it, what does that mean? A person sells property for a day? This the suffix yoim echad shema lo yitrafena memenu. Maybe he won't collect. So what is he saying here? So it's interesting that this even comes up, but you have to listen to the svara. Reuven sells Shimon a piece of land. Now, there are creditors who come to Shimon and say, not so fast. This was pledged to us. We're taking this back. So now, what happened? This property, Reuven sold, rather, Shimon is now wants to collect from Reuven, right? He bought it. So number one, it's possible that when the debtor came, he came to Reuven, the creditor, and Reuven paid him from a different property. We're going to see in the Gemara later, there's an interesting concept, okay? And I mean, we know this in insurance and in other things, we put what's called last in, first out, right? LIFO, last in, first out. That applies here too. So listen to this. If Reuven sells Shimon a piece of property and creditors come and take it away, and Reuven, so now Shimon wants to get his property back. Reuven, meantime, he sold other lands to other people. So Shimon comes back, and so rather the creditor comes to Reuven, and he says, I want my money back. Or so he says, oh yeah, Yehuda has a piece of property that I sold him 2 days ago. So he's going to go to Yehuda. He's not going to go to Shimon. So he'll go to Yehuda to collect. Meantime, Shimon still has the property. So Shimon is willing to take a risk. Without a pledge, he's willing to take a risk that they won't come to him to collect the property back. They'll collect it from others, and he won't lose it. And if eventually he may lose it, he may hold it for a year or two. In the meantime, he's reaping a harvest 2-3 times the value of the property. Let's say he bought it for a very low price. He says, oh, for this price, I'm willing to take a risk. And that risk is that no one will come to him to collect. Because if they came to him to collect, he might not have recourse. So you see, what the Gemara is saying is, you see there are situations where a person is willing to take a risk without a pledge. In those cases, he says, then he will buy it for even 1 day. You don't impute that there was a pledge. You only impute there is a pledge in a malva and lova situation where you know that the malva is going to come to collect his money, and if there's no pledge, he has nothing. But in the case of a sale, it's possible no one will ever come to touch this land, and he is willing to take a risk. He's willing to take a risk. It's like someone buys stock or buys options. You buy options, right? You have a date by which that option expires. Why would you do that? You're losing your money. Teretz is, no, you're smart enough to say that something is going to happen between the time I bought that option to the time that that option becomes null and void, and I'm going to double my money or triple my money. So you're gambling, but you're saying, I'm willing to take that risk. But an option is a very cheap item. You don't pay the face price of the stock for an option. You pay a fraction of the price. So for that fraction of the price, I'm willing to gamble. That's the Gemara is telling us here, that he's willing to gamble because he feels, oh, I happen to know that this fella had a lot of property and he sold it after I bought mine. And I know the halacha that a creditor only goes to the last property first and makes his way back. I bought mine a year ago. He sold 3 properties in the last 5 months. Those properties are coming before me. So I have an insurance policy. I'm willing to take a risk. That's what the Gemara is telling us, is the chiluk between a halva, between a loan where no one makes a loan without a pledge, and therefore achrayas nechasim is imputed, or a sale where you don't impute because there's a risk that a buyer is willing to take. That's pshat in the Gemara.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Question for you.
Yeah.
If somebody is borrowing on his property, if he doesn't have the paper, the star, if he doesn't get paid, the person will take the property as the collateral that he gave to him. So he retains that. If he, let's say he borrows it's collateral for a year, he can't receive interest on that, the money that it's worth.
Correct.
So when you said before that, you know, if you let somebody, you give them a note and you take it without any collateral, you either get the mitzvah for letting him borrow it, but you really can't, you know, if you don't have the star, you can't get anything back for it.
Right. So if it's a business transaction, then it's not tzedakah. He expects to be paid back on the loan. So therefore, therefore the rule is that a person would never make a loan without a pledge of other property, because otherwise it's a fool who makes that kind of a loan, because he will never get paid back if the debtor has no money. If the debtor has no money and there's no pledge to another property, it's as if he threw away his money or gave tzedakah. So call it tzedakah. Why are you calling it a loan? You're calling it a loan because you're going to get paid back. How are you going to get paid back? I'm not sure. He better have some money. But if he borrowed, he may be a poor enough guy that he has no money, but he has some property. At least get a hold of his property so you won't be sort of adrift. So therefore, the Gemara imputes that in such a case, a lender would never be foolish enough not to lend with collateral. Therefore, if collateral is not mentioned in the note, it's not his problem, it's not his fault, it's the sofer who omitted a line saying there was collateral. So we're blaming the sofer, and we're allowed to blame the sofer and say that he really meant to lend with collateral because he never would have done it without. That's how we're interpreting the Gemara. That it's imputed that there has to be collateral, and if there isn't, it's the sofer's fault. That's in the case of a loan, because otherwise, how will he get paid back? In the case of a sale, whole different set of circumstances. One person buys from another, and he's willing to take certain risks. Why is he willing to take risks? It's like I said, because he's gambling. He's gambling twofold. First of all, he's gambling that if there is a pledge from someone else, and I don't have a pledge to my seller, he'll never come to me because he'll go to other properties. And even if he comes to me after a time, I will have reaped the benefits of this land through produce that will far exceed my purchase price because I'm buying it cheap enough. So if I till it and have one harvest, I'll double my money. And if he takes it then, take it then. It's okay because I already made my money. But he's gambling. When you're gambling, when you're buying and selling, meaning that you're taking that risk, then if there is no pledge in the shtar, it means it was never agreed upon. It wasn't a mistake of the sofer that he omitted a line saying there was a pledge. It was a negotiation between a buyer and a seller, and the buyer was willing to say, you know what, I'm going to buy this without a pledge because I am confident enough that I will get the value of my purchase out of this, either through no one will ever come to get it, or because by the time they come to me, I will have taken a lot out of it already, and I won't feel terribly bad if they take it from me. So that's what Rashi explains, that it'll be one of the two. Either they'll never get to me, or I will I'll eat a lot of produce out of this property to make it worth my while. So Shmuel, so the teretz is that Shmuel really does say that it's not a kasha because two different circumstances. One is a loan and one is a purchase.
So,
yeah.
Question. So then it sounds like maybe one key here is that in what we think of normally in the modern days with banks with interest, et cetera, or even if it's a private individual, but with interest, is that if you have a loan without collateral, essentially it's the interest, which if the loan isn't collectible, they're not going to get the interest or the principal back, but that interest overall on average is making it worthwhile to make those loans without collateral. But then here, because according to the Torah, Jew to Jew, you can't charge interest, so therefore the collateral became effectively a requirement, not that you had to have collateral, but nobody would loan without collateral, whereas today with interest it becomes the reverse. Is that sort of?
Yeah, I think that's a fair analogy to look at it. But today, now of course we have heter iska, but today the way we get around interest is because when you charge fixed fees, for instance, on loans, now a bank doesn't worry about rivets, but when you charge, if two people, two Jews want to transact and yet you can't charge interest, then there's the concern that you're going to chill the ability of people not to be able to borrow money. You have the wealthy guy, he'll never lend his money because he will be over, at the whim of the borrower. If the borrower doesn't pay him, then it's too late. So today, of course, we establish different ways of making it work through fees or other things that are not considered interest. Okay, so we have a way of approaching it. But yeah, the way you're saying it is in effect correct. Is that we make that kind of a distinction. But certainly in the time of the Gemara, where there were aniyim who had Now, if they don't have any property, then they're really in trouble, because then why will anybody lend to them? So again, that you had a gemach, you had a lender who maybe got a pledge from a third party, whether it was whoever it was, that would say, you make these loans and somehow we'll be able to reimburse you if you don't. But certainly it was a problem. But there were people who didn't have liquidity. This is really maybe an issue more on a liquidity question, is that he had property, but how does he translate that property into money? So basically he has to take a loan and make a pledge. Okay, you take a loan, you make a pledge, that makes sense. And you're good for your word, and you'll repay. If you don't repay, then I have the pledge. But if there's no pledge, then who would make the loan? Teretz is Tol Sofer, that the Sofer is the one who you can always point to as making the error, because no one would otherwise lend. In buying and selling, again, I gave the example of a stock. With an option, people gamble like that all the time. They gamble that they bought something that will translate into a profit, even though there's a great risk. So in the case of buying and selling, it's equally likely that there was no pledge, because, as the Gemara says, the sofer consults with the seller on every prat of the sale. That's because it's a sale. Now the seller can say, I'm willing to pledge on this, not on this. So he has his choice. So anyway, so that's the teretz, but we're not finished yet. So now we want to make a nice distinction between a loan. What's the example? The example of that is Kahu Avua Bar Ihi Zovan Alisa Meachosa. There was Avua Bar Ihi bought his sister owned a let's call it a duplex. She owned a duplex, and he bought the upstairs apartment from his sister. Also, Balchov, the sister, meantime, had pledged that upstairs apartment to somebody else, and the Balchov comes tar from the many, and he took it away from Avra Ba'i. So he came also Lakame de Shmuel. Shmuel was the Gadol Ador, so Avra Ba'i came and he had a tie on his sister, and he said, "Look, I bought this from my sister." Omalei. So Shmuel asked him, "Kosra lacho achrayis? Did your sister? Did you when you did the shtar mechira? Was there a pledge, a shibud?" Omalei lo. He said, "No, I didn't get a pledge from my sister." Omalei came zil liz l'shlomo. He says, "Go in peace." And that was basically, he said, you made a mistake. You made a mistake. So Avua Ba'i, wait a minute, said, "Not so fast." Omalei. You, Shmuel, are the one who said Achrai is Tor Sofer. You're the one who said that. You authored that opinion that Achrai is Tor Sofer. Of course, there had to be a pledge here. It must be a Tor Sofer. Amalei. So Shmuel answered him, Hanamili Bishtar Halvo. I said my opinion of Tor Sofer by a loan. Bishtar Meka Famemka. Lo. Why? David Inish the Zovan Ara Liyume. So this episode sort of is the clincher that this distinction that Shmuel makes between Halva and Mekach and Memker is a valid distinction, because in this particular case, he bought the apartment, he didn't get a pledge, and basically Shmuel told him, "You're out of luck. You're out of luck, because in a Mekach and Memker, you specifically negotiate. The sofer does nothing on his own. He has to go to the seller for every prat in the shtar sale. And by the way, you see, I mean, those who are in business and engage in contracts, you'll see, and Yale can opine here, is that these shtaras are so meticulously negotiated that every line and every sentence and every word is parsed, so that it make it as airtight as possible, because you can't even imagine the circumstances that might arise in a shtar in a particular situation, and they do. Unfortunately, there are ambiguities that come about, and you always have the question, what was meant? Therefore, you parse it and you dig it and you dig it to every degree. Alvos, he said, no. Alvos simply, I'm loaning you money. And if I'm loaning you money, I'm not giving tzedakah. Otherwise, I would have given you the money. If I'm loaning you the money, then of course I would have to get some kind of assurance. Therefore, if the assurance wasn't written, It's not our mistake. It's the mistake of the sofer. We all overlooked it, but everybody understood, the lover particularly, but the malva and the lover understood that there was a chrayas in this shtar. So he said to him, Zil l'shlomo, says Rashi, third line of the Rashi, the wide line, Ein kan odin shemachlas alakol. You are meichel on everything. Okay? So, end of story. That's the machlokes. That's the distinction that Shmuel makes now. Okay, so and that's the end of the parsha. Okay, so now there's no tiyuf on Shmuel because Shmuel's the emperor, he gives himself a teretz, and then we go back and forth. Now the Gemara picks up on a side subject on this. The question we have in legal parlance, it's called the question of standing. Standing means that if when two people come to court or to Bezdin, there has to be a reason why the Bezdin would listen to the two of them, right? One person has a tie on another, they have to be relevant. So there is something called standing, that you have to have the right to be in court in a particular situation. So here's the circumstance. Abaya, Reuven shemacha sada l'Shimon. Reuven sells a field to Shimon ba'achrayis, with a pledge. He sells it to him with a pledge. And the balchov of Reuven, the seller, comes v'kotorov le'minei, and he takes it from Shimon, the buyer. So now, who has a taina? Shimon, right? Shimon has a taina. To who does he have the taina? Does he have the taina to Reuven or to Levi, the third person who is the balchov, the person who is owed money by Reuven, right? So says the Gemara, Dinahu, the Reuven. Reuven is now the seller, right? Mishtoi Dina Bahadei. He can come in and defend. So wait a minute. Reuven is the seller. Shimon is the buyer. Levi is the one who is owed money, and he comes to Shimon and he takes away the field. He says, here's my pledge. Sorry, it's my field. Now, Shimon is out of field. He's out the money. So what's going to happen? Shimon is going to taina to Reuven. Says the Gemara, Reuven can intercede and taina to Levi on behalf of Shimon, because Shimon really had, the land was taken away by Levi. Levi took the land away. So Levi is sort of the interloper here, right? So now Shimon is going to come back to Reuven and say, Reuven, you owe me money. Reuven says, not so fast. I'm going after Levi. So now Reuven and Levi are, as Shimon would be the one withstanding, Reuven is now coming in and saying, wait a minute, Shimon, stand aside. I'm going to take up this case with Levi because he had no right to take away the land. His chov was improper. That's what the Gemara is telling us. That Dinahu de Ozel Reuven, who sells to Shimon, u'mishtoi Dina Bahadei, lo matzah omale, and Levi can't say lav bal devorim de diat. You have no business in this lawsuit. The lawsuit is between me and Shimon being the buyer, because Levi's going to say, you know what? It's Shimon who is the loser here, who is at a loss, right? Not you, Reuven. You sold him a piece of property. So we're going to jump ahead and know the answer in a minute, but basically, Reuven is going to come and say, I am going to fight this out, Shimon, on your behalf with Levi. And Levi can't say, Lav bal devorim de diat, you're not my litigant here. Okay? I mean, again, so you understand what's going on here. Because the buyer is the one at loss. But who took his field? The Balchov, Levi. So he would naturally go back to Reuven. So Reuven would, you now owe me the value of the field or another field because what you sold me was taken away from me. So Reuben says, not so fast. I'm going to fight this out with Levi. And Levi says, what do you mean? You have no business in this. It's me and Shimon who have to deal, not you, Reuven. Reuven says, no. The Amalei, the Maps Kimine, Olai, the Hodder. So Reuven can say, the reason why I can intercede is because if Shimon loses, he's coming after me. He's coming after me, the seller. And I'm intervening because I don't want him to come after me because there's a legitimate reason why you, Levi, should not get this property. You interceded and said you had a pledge and therefore you took the property away, which means what? That the buyer can go back to the seller and demand another property or money. Reuben says, no, I don't buy that. I'm interceding here because you, Levi, are improper. So let's take a look at Rashi. He sold to him ba'achrayis, meaning imitrefenu mimenu yishalom lahu. So Reuven sold it with achrayis, with a pledge that if something happens to the property, someone comes and takes the property from Shimon, I will repay. So he has committed to repay. So he's saying the ashtur yedina bahadei, the balchov l'solke, right? Me'al Shimon b'chol tainer sheyachalitin v'lomer praticha kach v'kach. The reason why Reuven is saying I can intercede here with Levi is for one of two reasons, says Rashi. Either he will say, wait a minute, Levi, I already repaid you on the loan, on the chov that was pledged. You're coming and collecting from Shimon on a pledge that I already repaid you. Or you and I, Levi, transacted a separate transaction, and now this property is repayment for the transaction. So the reason why Reuben is interceding here is because he is defending the property that Shimon wouldn't even know. Shimon is the buyer. He has no nexus to Levi. Levi comes out of the blue and wants his property back. And Reuben says, you know what? You, Shimon, don't know anything about this. I'm defending because I and Levi have history. And that history is that we already transacted and I repaid him. I don't owe him anything anymore. He is coming and he wants to trick you into saying, oh, I have this shtar. Remember, maybe not like Shmuel, so it wasn't canceled. So he has a shtar that says that he's entitled to this land. Says Reuben, not so fast. I'm defending here because that land is no longer pledged. I repaid the pledge. That's why Reuben says, I have standing here. I can interject myself, even though Levi says you don't have standing, because I'm dealing with Shimon, not with you. Teretz is, you're wrong. I can intercede because I have standing. Lo motza b'chov, says Rashi, lemei malei lav bal devorim dediat, that you're not my litigant. B'davazer karka Shimon ani nodal im yesh l'chot teviyah alai hamidenu bedin. Why? The mapskis minei al hador. Masha ata motza mishimen yaksa olai. In other words, I am a valid litigant in this matter, because if you, Levi, are successful in taking the land away from Shimon, Shimon comes back to me because I gave him a pledge. So I have to repay him. So I have every right to defend that pledge. So that's what the Gemara is telling us. In other words, this is back in the day, right? Before we know all the laws of standing with the courts in particular, that someone can't just interject himself in a lawsuit and say, I want to be a party to this lawsuit. You have to have a reason to be in court. Says the Gemara, a situation where you might think that the mocher should have no standing because it's between the buyer and the balchov. Says the Gemara, no, that when there is a chrayis, when there is a pledge, the seller has every right to be in the middle here because he's defending himself not only from the balchov, but also from the buyer, who would then come back to him and say, you owe me another piece of land because you pledged that this was a good sale, and now I come to find out that it's not a good sale. So the Gemara tells us here, as an aside, that is in this whole discussion of land, there's this other little point. Now, lest you think that it only applies by achrayis, says the Gemara, Ike the Amre, Afilu shelo ba'achrayis nami. If Ruvain sold a piece of land to Shimon without achrayis, without a pledge. Now, if he sold them without a pledge, what would you say? What would be your thought in this situation where the Baal Chov comes and he grabs and says to Shimon, my land? What would you think? That does Reuben have a right to have standing where he didn't pledge, and there's no way that Shimon can come back to him to get the property? Remember, the reason why we're saying he has standing is he's an Ogeya B'davar, because if this property is taken away, Shimon will come back to Ruvain and claim a piece of land because he gave him a pledge. Therefore, he can interject himself to defend against the pledge. What happens if he didn't give a pledge? Does he have a right to interject? L'chayra, he should have no right to interject. He should have no standing here because he doesn't have a sort of a horse in the race. Assuming that the Baal Chov takes the land away from the buyer, buyer's out of luck. Where's he going to go? There's no achrayus, there's no pledge. He can't go back to the seller and take it back from the seller. There's no pledge. So you might think that there's no standing, says the Gemara, this iked amre, afilu shelo ba'achrayus nami. Even when there was no pledge, the Reuven has standing. The Amalelo nichali de lahada l'Shimon tarumas alai. I don't want Shimon to have tarumas. Tarumas means that he has tinus on him. He has every time he sees him, it'll be uncomfortable because he'll say, "Oh, you suckered me into buying this land," and therefore there'll be bad feelings. So you see, the Gemara goes so far to say there's an Ikka de Amr that says even with bad feelings, if you create a hostile environment, even where there's no ability to collect, but the hostile environment alone is what will create standing. Now, do we say that in our courts today? I don't know. Yale, do you ever have a circumstance where hostile environment is going to create standing in a major lawsuit? I'm not sure, unless there's a goodwill element, and maybe you can argue goodwill, that goodwill is something sort of tangible that you can defend. I don't know the answer, but if it is, then maybe they're standing. But that's exactly what the Gemara is saying. He's saying there's tarumas, there's goodwill here. I don't want people coming around saying that I was a thief because, you see, I tricked him into buying a piece of property for me that I knew would be taken away, and I'm taking advantage. And that might hurt me in other cases because no one will want to do business with me. They'll think I'm a cheater. So says the Gemara, because of in Tarumis, just in Tarumis alone, there is enough of a emphasis that you shouldn't have a bad feeling. You're allowed.
Is the Gemara telling us that Reuven's assertion of standing has to be accepted by the Beis Din, or is it up to the Beis Din?
No, he's saying that it has to be accepted, that he has a right.
Shimon might think he has a better chance without Reuven.
Well, he might, but Reuven, you see, Reuven and Shimon, up to a point, are on the same side. Now, Shimon can say, no, you're right to the point where Shimon can say, Reuven, I don't want your help. I'm plenty capable of taking care of this. But Shimon is never the one who's going to say it. It's the Baal Chov who really knows that Reuven is a tough guy, and Reuven may have him at his wits because Shimon doesn't know history. He doesn't know what happened before. So it's the Baal Chov who's going to make the taina, not Shimon. Shimon will never tell the best, I don't want Reuven in this case. Because two heads are better than one, so to speak. Even though he may be angry at Reuven because Reuven tricked him, but Reuven's going to say, I didn't trick you. This guy he's a chakran. He's coming to collect money that I already repaid. Or there's another debt, and this is a repayment from another debt, as Rashi said. So wait a minute. Before you try to fight the Baal Chov on your own, let me help you because I have standing. It's the Baal Chov who wants to kick Reuven out, because if he kicks Reuven out, then he may have clear sailing with Shimon. Shimon has no other taina. Reuven may have a taina, but if the Beis Din isn't going to allow Reuven in, then he wins. So the Gemara is telling us that Reuven can interject himself in here and says, I have standing, which means that he and Shimon can talk it over. And he'll explain to Shimon, Shimon, you have a taina, I have a better taina. Let me be the one to take the taina because I can exonerate, I can make this all go away. So in that regard, the Bezdin is here without, they say, okay, you got three people here. What are you all doing here? What are you doing here? And that's usually what happens in court is that the Bezdin, the court asks everybody, why are you here? Okay, and everybody says, here's why I'm here. The Baal Chov is going to go to the court and say, court, you got to exclude Reuven. He has no business being here. This is between me and Shimon. And Reuven says, not so fast. I have a reason for being here. So to your question, the court will dig into it to actually make a determination that there is standing, because you have three people and a machlokes, between, the machlokes should be between two, not three. So they're going to say, well, what's the third person here? So when Reuven explains why he's here, the rest will say, okay, you have standing. And now there will be a meaningful discussion between all three, and the Bezdin will then be able to make a proper judgment hearing the case of all three. But it's the Baal Chov who wants to exclude Reuven, not Shimon. Shimon will welcome any help he can get, even though initially he may be upset that he thinks Reuven sold him a bill of goods, but he didn't sell him a bill of goods. He really sold him a valid contract. It's just that the Baal Chov was the one who was tricking. So in any event,
Rabbi, it's interesting. In a secular court, I don't think preserving your good name gets you standing.
that's my
That's
point.
Yeah.
But the question is, the question is, what's the value of goodwill? Because goodwill is an important commodity in business. If a person's name is besmirched and his intentions are besmirched, or a corporation is accused of being a chakran, even if they win this case, don't they have a fallout in other matters as a result of a bad image? So image, the question is how much does image play in a lawsuit where your goodwill, your name is what you have to sell? If you're a drug company and you're accused of putting impurities in a drug, even if you come out a winner, you're a loser because you've now been impugned. So to the extent that you protect your good name, that's pshat terumas. Terumas is tainus. Tainus may in themselves not go anywhere, but you want to defend against tainus. So the Gemara here says that because of tarumas, because of the fallout from tainus, you are allowed to defend yourself and protect your good name. So I think that maybe that is a question that maybe a court, if you come in and again, the stakes being very high in monetary matters, will the court allow a person to come in where there's no monetary loss, but there is the loss of name, goodwill, which could translate into millions of dollars, or who knows. So anyway, but you see in the time of the Gemara that this Iked Amre went so far as to say it doesn't have to be a specific pledge. Even without a pledge, there's a reason to allow Reuven to come in to defend because of tarumas. Anyway, it's an interesting thought. Again, it's the purity of the Gemara says that people shouldn't be allowed to go around tricking other people, and this way, if Reuven has a legitimate time against the Baal Chov, because the Baal Chov doesn't have a right here, but he wants to trick Shimon into saying this is my property, Reuven can say not so fast. So anyway, okay. So we'll stop here. It's a logical stopping point, and then it's from next week. We'll pick up from here on Yudalit Amanal.
Good. Thank you, Rabbi.
Menashe still on?
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Is Menashe still on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Menashe, quick question. Again, this is not on the shiur directly. I have your site tomorrow. Are you in shul? Can we do a male for my? I don't know if you do it anyway. Because you have.
Well, we normally do on Shabbos, but if you want to on the day of the Yortzeit, we can do
the day of the Yortzeit's tomorrow, so I'm going to be at the cemetery. So if we do it on the day, I'd like it on the day of the Yortzeit.
Okay.
No problem. Yeshikayach. Okay, everybody, Yeshikayach, and Mitzvah Shem. Next week we'll pick up from here.
Shvuah Tov.